And it also leads directly into the next presentation. And I invite Sir Alan Wilson, who is going to speak, could speak at a university platform with great experience and elegance, but he's going to speak as the lead of the expert group of the Foresight Future of Cities project. It's not an acronym, but it's a long title.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm actually going to wear two hats. I'm certainly going to wear that one, and I'm also going to wear my academic hat because I'm actually going to make a plea. In a sense, John Miles talked about the need for more critical analysis. I'm going to talk about what science can offer this process. And I partly do that because the Future of Cities Foresight project is driven by the Government Office for Science, the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, in-house project team led by Lara Jones, who's here, a lead expert group that I chair. So what I wanted to do for 7.5 minutes or 7 minutes now is describe the beginnings of that project. And then I want to use my other 7 minutes for saying what science in a broad sense might have to offer this. So I think that slide just says what I've just said. So I'll move on to cities. Most foresight projects in the past have been much more well defined. So we've actually taken on an enormous challenge. And in terms of bringing together a whole variety of disciplines, I won't read them out, it's the second bullet point there. But the first bullet point, in a sense, makes the most important point. There's a tremendous amount of work on cities, but it's actually very fragmented. And we've taken upon ourselves the challenge of integration in terms of both the science and the policy. We're going to operate at two spatial scales, two geographies, if you like, the UK system of cities, and then we're going to take some case study cities, of which London will almost certainly be one, but there will certainly be others. And very ambitiously, we've taken, since we expect to publish in 2015, this is a 2-year study, a 25-year and a 50-year time horizon. And I was quite relieved to hear that we're not totally out of court when I heard Edward Lister saying that he, for London, needed to take a 50-year time horizon. So, UK system of cities, that's actually an income distribution based on wards that defines city boundaries. It actually shows the north-south divide, or rather the south-west to the Wash divide that Peter Hall was talking about this morning. We can zoom into finer scales, and indeed even finer scales than that. And if I move north, you'll see actually income levels drop. I was taken, I think it was Peter Hall this morning, was actually talking about bits of the north in the south and bits of the south in the north. If you know North Leeds and you know South Manchester, you actually see the bits of the south that are in the north there, but of course it's mostly northern. Anyway, what are we going to do in the Future of Cities project? We're going to try to establish a baseline, so cities as they are now, how people live in cities, urban economies, flows and interactions, obviously person movements, but something more broadly which we call the urban metabolism, which would embrace energy and materials flows, governance of cities. And then we are going to try and look ahead, and the kind of imagination that's just been called for, we have to find a way of building into our 2040 and 2065 scenarios. And we'll actually try and use the lens that we develop, which I call there an e-atlas, a way of looking and getting an intelligent view of cities and their interdependencies. And indeed, I'll say a bit more about what the science can offer that. The understanding that we have now and what it will look like when it's translated into what are likely to be and will be very different futures in 25 years and 50 years' time. And the challenge of scenario building to look at the spectrum of possibilities is huge. And of course, because of where we sit in the Government Office for Science, our objective is actually to say to central government departments, a lot of them involved in cities, and to local government, something about the policy decisions that can be taken now that have impacts in these for these long-term scenarios. And Edward Lister gave us a superb account of what that implies for London, but it was actually the way he was talking about it necessarily shorter run rather than the longer run, and even the short run is rather terrifying. So what are the big questions that we're looking at? The demographic drivers will demand different things: an ageing population, migration, social disparities, changing household structures, changing retail structures, health structures that we've heard about earlier today. What makes a strong economy? Certainly high skill levels, high levels of connectivity, different kinds of clusters, the cultures that attract inward investment. How will urban structures evolve? Again, we've heard a lot about that today. Peter Hall this morning was very interested on that, and so we're talking about long life infrastructures, the transformational features that John Miles has just been talking about. And then what makes a successful city in terms of governance? The mayor's question, innovative finance. We heard a lot about that, again, very helpfully to set the context for this from Edward Lister. Where does the money come from for major capital investments and what you might call adaptive capacity? And again, questions about resilience and future proofing. I always like to keep in my mind what I call my wicked problems list. And that is the problems of cities that we've actually known about for a long time. Governments of all complexions have actually attempted to tackle these problems. And I just think these kinds of challenges need to be there to force us to have a degree of realism in terms of what we're trying to achieve. I think the day's conference has been fantastic for that. For me, if I just take one example, Peter Hall on Blackpool and North Lancashire this morning absolutely characterised what I meant by the seaside towns problem. But there's potentially a long list, and when you try and put some of this into the future, inner city regeneration we know about, the future of work we actually really don't know about. We talk about shifts to a knowledge economy. I'm an optimist, and I believe that it will generate appropriate numbers of jobs, but we don't really know that because there are going to be some very dramatic transformations. Housing, schools, health, multiple deprivation. Again, Peter Hall gave some striking examples of that this morning, where the criminal justice system works, climate change and so on. Potentially a long list. So I want us to be realistic in what we can try to think about and develop. So that's my first 7 minutes. My second 7 minutes, I want to switch then to say, how can we represent the kind of understanding? What is science going to, what can it offer us now? And what is it going to offer in the future? And that slide, I'm going to talk very much from my perspective, and obviously this is a sub-science, if you like, within a much broader set. But one of the things that I'm interested in is being able to simulate cities realistically in computer models that represent what we know now and what we might begin to know about the evolution of cities, so that that can actually inform inform our work. There's a mini sermon comes in the middle of this that I always argue that we actually know a lot. Again, it's very fragmented. I'll say a little bit more in a minute about what we know, but it's never actually treated as big science. there's a frustration in me that as urban scientists we could actually offer a lot more to this field than we're actually in many ways enabled to do. So what is it we're trying to model? This is another way of just having a very broad picture of a city, population and population systems on the left-hand side of that diagram, the economy on the right-hand side, massive interaction, transport, telecoms, all the different forms of interaction that connect the economy with how people live in cities. And these activities carried on a very complex infrastructure. We're at a point with the science where we're pretty good at modelling the activities, and we can actually do that pretty accurately. Modelling the evolution of infrastructure is actually much harder, and it's actually scientifically more challenging because we're actually dealing with complex nonlinear systems. And again, what lurks for all these kinds of systems that we know about these systems in general is the possibility of phase changes. Actually dramatic changes in structure, uses of structure. I can think of lots of examples in the past. I'm just about old enough to remember when food shopping was done in corner shops. Suddenly it became possible to have supermarkets, and they were there. And it happened in about a 5-year period. And in urban terms, I mean, it's not quite like ice to water to steam phase change, but in terms of the mathematical models, it's a phase change. So we have to somehow anticipate that there are possible phase changes for very complex systems, and actually think about where it is possible to get to from where we now are. And I tend to think of the complex infrastructures, and that includes all the network infrastructures in telecoms as well as transport, as the DNA of the city. And the DNA of the city will in part determine where we can get to in 10 years, 20 years, so on. And so what we then get into is what I would call genetic planning. So it's the planning equivalent of genetic medicine. How do you tweak the DNA to get to more desirable futures? And that is a very complex business. Now the next slide really takes the diagram that I've just had and said, what do we know? Demography, we can do pretty well, give or take migration. We can, in principle, build input-output models of urban economies. But again, give or take the Cambridge Econometrics model of London. I don't know of another example in the UK. There are regional models, but I'm not. But again, it's frustrating because we can do it, but we don't do it. We can model the flows very well. We know how to load flows onto networks. We can model the impacts of different kinds of transport systems. We can do retail. We can do services like health and education, although we don't do that. We do it for retail, at least the retailers do, because they know the value of this kind of analysis. Within health and education, again, a bit of frustration because we don't do that. And then when you get to the end of this, and I'm then in danger of repeating myself, modelling the evolution of cities is very much more challenging. And then I threw in this slide just to say comprehensive models exist. This happens to be something called the Delta model, which the David Simmons consultancy in Cambridge runs. So I'm not talking, as it were, pie in the sky here. For much of at least the short-run analysis, we have the science, and we're beginning to understand the nature of the long-run challenges. So we have these challenges. We think now, really going back to the Future of Cities Foresight project, we can articulate the major questions. We want to build a good information system. We can be helped by the core science and the potential for a computer-based information system, some model building, need to think about the wicked problems. And again, I have 2 slides left. And in some ways, this is my main slide. Something I learned a long time ago from an American colleague that I used to work with, Britton Harris, who's a planner. And Britt always used to say, there are 3 kinds of activity in planning. And there's policy, there's design, and there's analysis. And what I mean by design here is, I mean something very broad, like inventing solutions. So inventing solutions to problems or inventing new futures. And what Britt used to say, and it's never left me, is that these are different kinds of thinking, and you very rarely get them in the same team. And so policy is obviously about our objectives, design is about invention, as I've said, and analysis is about the science, if you like. I'm really talking as an analyst. So I then say that most academics are not strongly connected to policy, most policymakers are not strongly connected to analysis, neither is actually very strongly connected to design in terms of inventing solutions. So there's a major challenge in as it were, forcing all that together. And in terms of the Future of Cities project, we want to try to take on that kind of challenge. And we have then a long stakeholder list, and you know, this is a fairly obvious one, starting with ministers, going through local government, and through to through to academia. And so what we want to do is to establish common grounds and the dialogue in relation to these very challenging problems, and to, in particular, to take on, you know, what I think are the challenges of fragmentation of different professionals, different policymakers, different academics working in different parts of this landscape, and attempting to draw them together and to offer in 2 years' time some kind of comprehensive picture. We certainly won't solve all the problems, but we hope what we will do is stimulate a further round of debate and what I would like to think of as science-based policy. Thank you.